and we have a terrific audience and terrific speakers. It's a particular pleasure to welcome the Secretary of Health and Human Services of the Commonwealth, Ronald Preston, who we'll be hearing from shortly, and very importantly, Senator Susan Tucker, who is the chair of the Joint Committee on Human Services and Elderly Affairs. Thank you both for being here this morning. To get us started, I'm going to introduce Michael Weeks, who is the president of the Massachusetts Council of Human Services Providers, which was founded in 1975 as the state's largest statewide human services trade association, and there is some biographical information about Mr. Weeks and our other speakers on the reverse side of your program. In the interest of time, I will not go through it, but Michael, it's a pleasure to have you, and I'll welcome you to the podium now.
Well, thank you, Paul. Good morning. On behalf of the Mass Council of Human Service Providers, I want to welcome you to this historic event as we unveil this report and analysis that we hope holds promise towards providing a foundation for reforming our purchase of service system in Massachusetts. The Council, as the state's largest human service membership association, committed to improving the sector, sought a comprehensive yet focused analysis of the system, a system that we felt had slowly eroded the opportunity of the promise to provide a quality human service system to the 1 of 10 citizens in need. To accomplish this task, we looked and thought that it made sense to find an organization that could provide what we knew was going to be a massive undertaking. We wanted an organization that had impeccable credentials and a reputation for high policy research and analysis that was not only impartial but nonpartisan, and an analysis that would get the wide respect of many of the people in Massachusetts. In doing that, we looked to the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. Now, some folks immediately said, that's an odd couple to have the Mass Council of Human Service Providers, an advocacy group, with a group that has a reputation for trying to be, and are, in fact, impartial. But we thought that that was exactly the group that we needed to convey the message that there was something not right in the system, a system that did not live up to the expectations that we started 30 years ago. So when we looked around, it was clear to us that we had an opportunity here to do something that perhaps had not been done before. We looked for funding. We were very pleased that the Boston Foundation, a convener, and a major foundation provided substantial funding for us. And there are a number of other foundations throughout the state who also had listened to their members, had looked in their communities, and felt that, yes, there was a need to do something with the system. And they participated in helping to fund this particular undertaking. Our problem in the council for our members are many and varied. One of the things that we clearly wanted to talk to folks about is that it wasn't necessarily a system that was bloated. It wasn't necessarily a system that had too much money or underfunding. We tried not to assign blame about who is responsible for the problem. Our struggle was to try to find a way that we can have a credible analysis of what was wrong and hopefully provide an opportunity and a foundation for fixing it. We think that the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation have done an outstanding job in making that happen. We knew that the questions that kept coming up for the human service sector was one of accountability. Yet, when we looked at our system, it was surprising to some that if accountability was the issue, then we certainly had enough regulators and monitors, evaluators, and checkers involved with us. Not only were we monitored, evaluated, regulated, licensed through the Attorney General, Secretary of State, the State Auditor, Administration of Finance, Health and Human Services, central area and regional offices who have their own purchasing requirements for those involved in local municipal ordinances, and let's not forget the Internal Revenue Service, who granted us our IRS C3 statuses. Indeed, there were enough people looking, but there weren't enough people making sure that the clients we serve were receiving the value that they deserved. And for that, we felt there was a need for us to embark on this particular study. What was clear to us in doing this particular report, that virtually everyone we talked to, no one said, this is a bad idea, this is the wrong way to go. Everyone said, yes, something needs to happen, something needs to be done. So that fueled our passion for getting this done. it also meant that there was a lot more people that we needed to talk to. So we had numerous focus groups, numerous people were interviewed and talked to about this study. We went on for perhaps longer than we thought we initially were, but it was a sense that people really wanted to contribute to this process and wanted to feel that it made a lot of sense for us to do that. And it made sense. So what had become a promise infused with $25 million back in 1972, 30 years later, we have a system of $2 billion, and we still have to ask the question, are we living up to the promise? Are we providing services to the people in need? For that, we've looked to Michael Whitmer and the Mass Taxpayers Foundation to do that. I want to thank publicly Michael and his staff and Glenn Tepke, who've been an enormous amount of support for making this happen, and had the patience to deal with us, because as advocates, we clearly were fighting for things that we felt were important. And Michael pushed back on us and said that this is not an advocacy report. This is a report about the state of the human service system. So there may be some out there in the audience who may feel that not everything in the report is what they would have liked to have seen or everything that made sense, but we believe it provides the type of foundation that would begin the process, because this is a beginning. This is not an end. And we hope that we can engage you into that process with us and others. So on behalf of the council, I want to thank Michael, I want to thank the Boston Foundation and the other foundations and supporters, and I want to thank you who participated in this report. And now I'd like to introduce to you the person who's had the patience to deal with me and others and kept going at it, Michael Whitmer. Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you all for coming. It's a great turnout. Let me run through a few thank yous in terms of the production of this report and this forum. Anything of this complexity requires a lot of people who participated. So first, I want to thank the Boston Foundation, Paul and Cindy Rizzo in particular, who was our key person here for the funding and for hosting this forum. The other funders, mentioned briefly, Fidelity, Shaw, Davis, State Street, Fleet, and the Community Foundation of Western Mass. I'd like to very much thank Michael Weeks, the providers, Susan Wayne, Bill Little, Mike Ripple. They were the team that worked with us on this report through the long odyssey, and it's really been a pleasure to work with all of you and to get to know you. Steve Day and his colleagues at Technical Assistance Collaborative did all of the research, and that was very extensive, one-on-one interviews with people throughout the system, and then a number of focus groups across the state. And then finally, I want to recognize Glenn Tepke of our staff. Glenn is a superb researcher and writer, and he's the one who really in the end did the lion's share of this report, and it's an outstanding report, and I just want to thank Glenn publicly. Now, I'm not going to try to review all of the findings and recommendations of the report. We'd be here all morning into the afternoon, and you have plenty of literature that you can take with you in terms of this press release, the executive summary, and the full report in sort of ascending order of complexity and depth and detail. But I do want to make some overall points and put a framework on this. First, as Paul said, this is not about addressing this report and this analysis is not about addressing the fiscal crisis. In fact, we actually began it prior to the fiscal crisis. But clearly, this is not about saving money. It's about how the state spends its money in the $2 billion in the whole human services purchase of service system. So the fiscal crisis may afford us, in fact, I think does afford an opportunity to build on the reforms that have been begun at Human Services, but it's not about the fiscal crisis. And then the problems are systemic. It's always easier to identify sort of good guys and bad guys throughout any system as complicated as this. And obviously there are better managers and worse managers in state government, at provider organizations, and so forth. That's human nature. But The overarching conclusion of this report is this is a systemic problem. As the interviews took place and went through all the responses, there is frustration throughout the system among all of the players that it is not working the way that they would like to see it work, because obviously the vast majority of people involved in the system care about providing services to clients. I mean, many of you were here today. And so the frustration is real and it's palpable. So there are not good guys and bad guys. This is not about identifying agencies that are not up to the task, for example, or providers that aren't, but rather how can we change the system, in particularly the question of the incentives in the system. I've worked in and around state government now for 30-plus years. The thing that really strikes me through all of that experience is that if the incentives are in place and head in the right direction, good things happen. If the incentives are wrong, then it undercuts all of the good work. And if there's one overarching conclusion of this study, it's that the incentives are really wrong in the system or are not helpful. It's not right or wrong so much, but are skewed. The incentives are skewed, and they undercut all of the good work of the thousands of people in the system. Want to also emphasize that purchase of services, we're not saying is a failure. I happen to have been working in state government at the origin of the purchase of service system 30 years ago. On a personal level, that was one of the reasons I wanted us to do this study in collaboration with the providers. And I think we would all agree that the purchase of service system in broad strokes has worked and accomplished many of its goals, and despite some of the major frustrations throughout the system, decent care is provided for hundreds of thousands of people in the human services community, people in need. So nobody is suggesting, I just want to underscore this in the report, nobody is suggesting that we somehow return to the pre-POS days and somehow suggest that the state can provide this range of complex and elaborate services better than private providers. Finally, by way of broad overview, the reorganization that Secretary Preston has spearheaded we view really as the first phase of reorganization of human services, the pulling together of the 17 agencies into 4 clusters and other aspects of the reform that were in the fiscal 2004 budget. We view that as a first step on which this can then be a follow-through and build upon that. I think we would all agree, and I think the report makes clear, that collapsing agencies, while a good thing and giving greater focus, is only an initial step. And what we're really talking about here is the management of a $2 billion enterprise with 1,100 or more provider organizations and 500,000 clients. I mean, it's a huge enterprise, starting, as Michael said 30 years ago, with $25,000. Now, in terms of the findings and recommendations, just a minute on that, and all of these is laid out in your material. Clearly what we're saying in terms of the findings is that the system is not focused, the incentives are not focused on client needs. Individuals are, provider organizations do, the purchasing agencies all think about the clients, of course. So this is not a criticism of human behavior or human caring, but rather the system doesn't work to focus on client needs. And the clients, as a result, in many cases, as you're well aware, have enormous problems navigating the system, and especially in receiving the care they need, and especially where it's across multiple agencies. The flip side of that, if you will, is that the system is not designed, again, the incentive structure is not designed for high performance. Is there high performance in pieces of the system? Of course. It's not, again, a judgment of the work of individuals in the system, but the incentives are not are not encouraging that. Are not encouraging improvement in quality. There are lack of meaningful performance measurement and contracting for outcomes throughout the system, and lack of necessary performance information, so that it's not performance and quality standards and outcomes. It's more inputs rather than outcomes that drive the system. Specifically, just 3 or 4 points. The purchasing system has been hamstrung by its own rules and procedures, which has put too much emphasis on bureaucratic processes, compliance with regulations, and achieving narrowly defined programmatic objectives rather than producing results for clients. Each state agency has had its own policies and procedures for purchasing services, creating a myriad of often conflicting requirements for providers, including multiple licensing visits and varying data collection and reporting formats, diverting resources from improving the quality and impact of services. Thirdly, a growing gap between rates paid to providers and the cost of providing those services. Most rates have not been increased at all for well over a decade. This growing gap is producing a workforce crisis for providers and is compromising standards of care for those receiving services. And finally, compounding the situation at the broadest level, the Commonwealth has attempted to expand services without addressing the problems in the existing system, putting the emphasis on serving the maximum number of clients at the least cost rather than on the quality and outcomes of services. So if that's broadly the picture, then what is it that we're recommending in this report? Essentially, we've put up 4 poster boards which lay out the summary of our recommendations. I won't review those. They're in your materials. They're here. But I think in terms of the findings, you can see that we've organized our recommendations consistent with that, which is focusing on clients, focusing on performance, eliminating unnecessary requirements, and then setting priorities. We live in a real world in which we can't fund and meet all of the human service needs. I think one of the things that really comes through in all of this work we've done is that we really need to do a better job of setting priorities. Not that that's an easy process, and obviously that means that some people won't get the services that we'd like to see them get. I mean, in an ideal world, of course, we would all want to serve all of the needs of the Commonwealth, but we can never do that. So that's a difficult proposition, but it's certainly our argument in the conclusions of this report that avoiding that issue is actually driving down the quality throughout the system, and so it's not helpful to the clients or to anyone else. In conclusion, let me just say a few things about the next steps and the implementing of these reforms. First, I've touched already on the reorganization and the work of Secretary Preston, and whom I'll introduce in a moment. And we're very pleased to be collaborating with you, Ron, and appreciate the work you've already done in this area. When we met with the Secretary and Antonio, it was clear that a lot of the thinking that is embedded in this report was already going on, so I want to recognize that. It isn't as if Ron will comment specifically today, of course, but I don't want to pretend that somehow this was an eye-opener for the Secretary and his people. I mean, they're as aware or more aware than anybody of these kinds of frustrations and difficulties in the system. In terms of these recommendations, these are broad principles, if you will, a vision of how the purchase of service system should work. They're not detailed recommendations. We didn't feel we had the capacity to do that. Clearly, that is a project, an effort that's going to require the leadership of the administration and Secretary Preston. And we're under, and it's going to be a lengthy process. It's going to require a sustained effort. I think anybody who works in the system knows how complex and difficult it is. The kinds of issues that we're raising here today is really it's setting broadly a vision, but it's also a challenge. And the only way we can sort of renew and change the focus of the purchase of service system, we collectively, is through a collective enterprise in which all of the stakeholders are involved. And I think it's going to have to be built brick by brick, and we're certainly under no illusion. I'm under no illusion that one can do this in the space of a few weeks and magically snap a finger and all of this will change. And then in conclusion, I want to underscore again that the focus of this effort has to be on improving services rather than cutting costs. The reality is, as you all know, that human service agencies and budgets have been cut dramatically already over the last 3 years, and likely for the next year or two as well, given the enormity of the state's continued fiscal crisis. In addition, some of the recommendations here are going to require investments of dollars, I think around case managers, certainly the whole issue of rates. So if there is some savings embedded in these efficiencies, there are clearly also some costs. We didn't try to analyze either the savings or the costs because we thought what we were trying to do is lay out a vision and set the broad outlines of where we'd like the system to move. And again, to underscore that it was important to do that with services and the welfare of the clients as the focus rather than dealing with this as pretending that somehow this was going to help address the state's fiscal crisis. So that, in conclusion, is a broad overview of the report, the findings, the recommendations, the context, and what we've tried to do here. I should say that we at the Foundation have a track record, it's sort of how we operate, of not just issuing reports, holding forums, and then leaving, if you will, and hoping that others would pick this up. We try in a constructive way to stay focused on the results of our research and recommendations. And in many cases, there are issues that often take decades. I mean, we were involved 3 or 4 years ago in reform of the MBTA, put it on its own budget. That had been on our list of priorities for at least 2 or 3 decades. Finally, the opportunity came. This is a different set of challenges, of course, but I just use that example as one in which to say that we plan to stay involved in this, and we plan to do that as constructively as possible, but we view our research and work we do on something like this as a commitment, part of a long-term commitment to help bring about these changes and to be part of that process. Now let me introduce Secretary Preston. Ron, I appreciate very much your willingness to come here today and to lead this off with your comments. I think most of you know that the Secretary's been here since January. Was named by Governor Romney. Prior to that, he'd been 12 years as Regional Administrator for Medicaid. And then before that, he had worked 3 years in the U.S. Department of Education. Earlier in his career, had been a staff person for the Committee on Labor of the U.S. Senate. So Ron has had lengthy experience in the public sector. He's well aware of the complexity of the systems of not only human services, but of government generally, and the tugs and pulls. And I've appreciated the chance to begin to get to know him. And I'd like to introduce Secretary Preston. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good morning, everyone. I must begin, I have to begin with what everybody knows. And although there's never anything new under the sun, and the states have been in financial duress before, you know, as we've gone through economic cycles before, there has never been, in terms of its magnitude, a situation that we're facing now. As Michael pointed out, we've been facing, because of what's been going on in our economy and what's going on in revenues in the state, we've faced 3 years of contraction, and I'll come back to that point because the 3 years really matter because there's a cumulative impact of all of this. Everybody also knows that this is not the fault of Massachusetts or Massachusetts policy, that this is a rain that has fallen on all of the 50 states. Someone has told me that Wyoming is not in distress. I can't speak to that, but I can tell you just about everybody else is, and everybody knows about California. The fact that they could fire every state employee in California and still be in major deficit out there. I mean, that's how bad it is. Alas, alack, one of the things that happens when you face an economic downturn is the need for health and human services goes up. So, and we have a lot of entitlements out, you know, things that we've enacted, things that the federal government has enacted. So just at a time when there's less revenues on the state side, then the demand for services goes up. And this is another thing that is befalling all of the states in the country that puts us in a tremendous, tremendous financial bind. When you're in times like this, I almost think, particularly in terms of the magnitude of it, that we're sort of beyond politics. I know there's always a debate, you know, should we have new revenues? year. We live within the revenues we have. But everybody needs to appreciate that in times like this, everybody's revenues go down. Everybody, all the families, all the businesses, everybody is constrained. And therefore you don't have a lot of margin, whatever your politics are, to going that route. So there's a certain aspect of the situation. It could be move a little this way, it could move a little that way. But in general, it is just going to be dire, and we need to appreciate this. Now, while all of this is going on, we are essentially at war. And again, you might support it or you might not support it. You might think it's wise, you might think it's not wise. But the reality is that the country is at war. And the President has asked for close to $90 billion in new spending to deal with Iraq. The federal government is running a $400 or $500 billion deficit on its own. And all of my contacts down in Washington basically tell me to watch out, that all the federal agencies that we're working with are going to become very, very passive-aggressive in terms of any willingness to send you money or even to continue sending the money that they normally do. And all the plans that we have to apply for and everything that we have to deal with them is going to become somewhat more difficult. Now, I realize that we are running into, very quickly, a presidential election year, congressional election year. The parties, our great national parties, are very evenly divided in the country. And usually when you face a time like this, as we did back in '91 was something like that, federal largesse flows. And as the governor told me yesterday, an extra $20 billion or so out of the federal government right now would really be a big help to all of the states. But I think we all need to appreciate that this is not just the normal cycle because of what's going on overseas and things of that sort. And everything that we do in our planning, we certainly pray, we hope, we'll go down and lobby along with everybody else. But we can't count on that. So this, don't mean to be grim, but this is the situation that we're in. Now back to the 3 years. We have been squeezing our budgets for 3 years, and as all the human services providers will tell you, they haven't had a lot in the way of increases in rates for a very long time. Every time we go through this cycle, it gets more difficult. We are now at a point in which there's not a whole lot that we can squeeze out of our system, and what we can squeeze out of providers in terms of services and that. And so we're going to be facing some very major and difficult decisions, both the administration and the general court. This is not going to be a good year for any of us in terms of dealing with these things. It creates an implication for this report and all of this in terms of what we might do, and I really felt that it needed to be laid out for what it is. Some of this contraction that has been going on has also been going on in state government. There's a lot of state employees that have been lost in recent years. All of the state agencies are down staff. We had the legislature passed an early retirement bill in the last session, and I'm not going to know the full impact of that until about October 1st. But I suspect I'm going to be down a lot of people. And that also has an impact on the administration of things. And everybody needs to realize for all of the innovative things that we want to get together and work among ourselves and with all of you, all of that is going to be compromised by virtue of our situation. And just to point out an odd little fact, that the biggest piece of all of this is the Medicaid program. It always is. And the state's administrative costs for the Medicaid program are just a little above 3%. You know, try comparing that to private insurers and what they pay in administration. We don't really have a whole lot of administrative overhead in the Health and Human Services agencies. Now, Michael is talking a lot about $2 billion and human services purchasing $2 billion. I don't think of it that way. I think of all of Health and Human Services, which is moving in more close to $11 billion. Because the reality is that all of these services are intertwined. The services that we purchase, the human services providers, are very, very, very much related to the other kinds of entitlement rate providers like nursing home services and health services. The people that cost us the money, the people who are most in need, the frail elderly, the disabled, are people who generally need social services, human services, and they also need health services. And there has to be an integration between the two. And both in terms of how you administer all of these agencies, and even in terms of how you think about the budgets. One of the reasons that there hasn't been sufficient money on the human resources purchasing side of things is because the health side of things eats up so much money, particularly in terms of long-term care and things of that sort. Now, I noticed that you all had, waiting in your seats, an article by Rick Klein in the Boston Globe. It's sitting there about this report that was in the city section of the Globe today. As usual with Rick, it's a very well-written article, and generally speaking, very accurate, and I have only one issue with it. And that issue is that the recent reorganization of EOHHS was kind of a superficial thing, and really is not going to get too much into the working of these agencies. And I want to explain to you all why that is not the case. It is true that we all very early among ourselves decided that you have to have focus and expertise in terms of the specific missions and the specific populations that EOHHS serves. You do have the mentally retarded. You do have the aged. You do have the children. You do have public health. You do have mental health. And there are needed to continue to be agencies that focused on those things. But we also decided that all of these agencies do a great number of things in common. And what's the point of them all doing those things separately? And why that is germane to this discussion is that you need to appreciate that I did receive an advance copy of this report. And aside from things that I would love to be able to do and can't much do, like let's get more money into this and that, and let's have some financial incentives, and would that I could. That aside, for my part, it's just common wisdom. I mean, essentially the findings of this report are things that I've heard everywhere I've gone in the Commonwealth. It's what my own people feel. This is what we all feel that we must do. And in order to do that, essentially EOHHS, in some very significant respects, has to act like one agency, just one agency. And with that in mind, we are going to have a common purchase of services policy and set of policies. Chief Operating Officer here, Antonio Jimenez, is in charge of that effort. We are going to do common regulations. We're going to scrub through all of our regulations. We are going to have one common IT operation and things. We even have common press operations now and legislative operations. In many, many respects, we are going to move to act as a single department. Now, that doesn't mean that all the decisions are going to be made by me. That's not how we operate. Essentially, what we do is we have a core staff that deal with our functions that are in my office, but we also bring in the commissioners on a regular basis to go through things in common so that we can have the sort of collective approach and collective wisdom in terms of what we do. Because we always have to balance the specific needs that specific populations have to have. I don't want to lose that focus. The governor doesn't want to lose that focus. But it is absurd to have one vendor providing a single service to 5 different departments and to have 5 different sets of standards and 5 different sets of everything. I mean, there might have to be some differences in terms of the people that are served in their needs, and that is legitimate. But I certainly buy the general findings of this report that particularly in difficult times when we have not enough resources to do what we really do, we can't be stupid. And it gets to that point, having everything as fragmented as this, weighed down by the history and things of this sort. It also gives us a sort of unity, a much greater efficacy in terms of dealing out with our federal partners. I mean, everybody needs to appreciate how entwined the federal government is with our state agency and what it does. That if you look at the full, people think of the Medicaid budget usually as something called the Division of Medical Assistance. Well, sorry, it's many other places than that. It's in the Department of Mental Retardation, it's in the Department of Mental Health, it's in the Department of Public Health, it's in the Aging Agency, it's all over the place. And if you add it all up together, you are much closer to $9 billion than you are to $6 billion in terms of that. Therefore, that relationship with the federal government, and not just with my former agency, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, but all of federal HHS, it is much better to have a coordinated voice because we can push against, because some of this disparity of requirements that we have in terms of our specific programs comes from them. And there is a willingness on their part to think through some of these things. We are going to have a virtual front door through systems that however you enter our system, We'll be connected to everybody else, and we'll better figure out what services people need and things of this sort. Now, this is going to have to be balanced against people's privacy rights and to control their own fates and things of that sort. And we're going to have to build in firewalls and a lot of informed consent, and it's got to be carefully thought through. But there's an awful lot of coordination that we will be able to do that we haven't been able to do in the past. Whenever one talks about things like rates, particularly at a time when one doesn't have any money in one's bottom drawer, it is a very difficult topic. I do believe that the human services agencies, who have to essentially bid for contracts and what have you, have been for a long time at a very, very great disadvantage against the providers that HCFIP sets rates for, like nursing homes. And it has created over time a kind of imbalance. So that one of the whole emphases of what we would like to do is to do more things out in the community. And we often find that our community providers are at a disadvantage as opposed to our institutional providers. Again, dealing with that situation would be a lot easier if we had some money to toss around at this point to even things out, and we don't. But I want you all to appreciate that we do understand that, and that the general principle that we sort of have to evaluate what these services really take to provide, and this is something we have to do. Now, it's a little bit dangerous for us because then people will be coming in making arguments how their rates need to go up, but nonetheless, this is something that we feel that we need to do. There are essentially two large divides in terms of what we're trying to do here. One is related to the reorganization, the administrative reorganization, what we're going to do with purchasing, what we're going to do with regulations, what we're going to do with just operations, data processing, things of this sort, systems. I think that there is some potential in this for efficiencies. I think that there's a great potential in this for a greater ease of business for everybody that has to work with us. But honestly, I don't expect it to save huge amounts of money. And the problem is the rate of our agencies, the growth of our agencies, even if the times start to improve on us, we're not going to be able to keep up with that rate increase. And anything that we're talking about here isn't going to address that problem. So we have several other initiatives in the work. One that is associated with children, one that is associated with long-term care, and the other is just acute health care. Now, in order of magnitude, the one where all the dollars are, the one that we're going to have to get our hands around or we're all going to be in the soup, is long-term care. Long-term care is something that basically no one else really covers. It's not out there in the private insurance world. And the federal government is always hiding behind a bush someplace when it comes to that. I mean, anything the Medicare program can shunt off to us, it busily does. And it is largely a Medicaid, it's largely a state responsibility. And with the changing demographics, again, something everybody knows, we're all getting older, the baby boomers are getting there, because acute health care is so improved, we have actually a lot more disabled people than we used to have, because thank God they're living. But that means more people to be served. And this is going to be a very fundamental not to pun, but it's a long-term issue to deal with. We want to, again, change the emphasis in long-term care to a more community-based pattern, away from the expensive institutions and things of that sort. But quite frankly, we're probably going to have to duke it out with the public in terms of who's responsible for what. When a family's responsible, when is the state responsible? This is not going to be a happy topic, all things being equal. I'd rather not deal with it. But there's really nothing much we can do, because one of the things that's going to happen here is if we don't deal with this issue, there is going to be even less money that is going to be available on the purchasing human services part of thing. And it's like Godzilla. It's eating Chicago. It's a very, very, very difficult problem, but I don't want to make light of it in any way, because it deals with the fundamental values. It deals with a lot of situations that are hard to deal with. The governor wants to lay foundation so that everybody, one way or another, has access to acute health care. This is something he's been talking to me about this since we arrived in January. He appreciates, I appreciate, all of us appreciate that the way healthcare is climbing in terms of expense. There isn't any way of putting together the money to do it in any combination. I mean, so one of the things that we have to work very closely with the provider communities, with the professionals, is to try to get this healthcare delivery system down into a more coordinated fashion so that we can have something that we can actually afford. You know, in some combination of private responsibility and public responsibility. This is another long-term effort. The third of these, the children. Now, this is the poster child for all of this right here. What you're dealing with the kids is just absolutely extreme discombobulation. If you go out around the Commonwealth, you will and you don't, not just the Commonwealth. In my New England job, it was all the New England states, and then I very quickly learned it was all the states. We have a very large societal problem with distressed children. Lots and lots of distressed children out there. The courts have responsibility. The schools have responsibility. The healthcare establishment has responsibility. The social work establishment has responsibility. We have a lot of institutions in our society that have responsibility or role in all of this. And if you add them all up, there's really quite a bit of money involved in it. But no one works with anybody else. This is a very, very large problem. So one of the things that we're going to try to do, actually the focus of this is the Behavioral Health Commission, the Children's Behavioral Health Commission we have. But the task itself has gotten way beyond just behavioral health. We're going to try to do a much, much closer collaboration with the schools, much, much closer collaboration with the courts. We are, again, going to try to mesh our human services part of our operation with our health part of the operation to do some coordination for services with these kids. My hope is that, at least in this instance, there may be maybe close to enough resources to deal much, much better with this issue if we do a better job. In terms of the others, you know, long-term care is out over the horizon. Acute health care is an immediate problem. But at least so far as the kids are concerned, and actually in terms of all of this, that is probably the closest to the purchasing mission and closest to the topic today. We think that there's a great deal to be done. But my point here is what we have to do here is far beyond a sort of internal organizational management thing. That is going to be very vital to everything we do, but we're going to have some very serious policy program discussions as to what these programs are and how they're designed and how they fit together with the various players in the Commonwealth in order to be able to steal a march on this. But basically, I like their report.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Secretary Preston, particularly for that last line there. We were waiting with bated breath, Michael and I. Okay, are they going to like it or are they going to hate it? But so thank you. We appreciate that. And we also appreciate setting a context for the broader view of the system. I think the way that you articulated it, I sat there saying, God, I wouldn't want that job now. I mean, you've got some tremendous responsibilities in trying to make a lot of pieces fit that aren't used to fitting and probably never did fit. And so we wish you great success. And in fact, as Michael already mentioned earlier, we're in here for the long run. So the ways in which we can be helpful to you and the administration and others and helping to shape a system that really does realize the vision, we're here. We're willing and anxious to do that. We also, at this point, wanted to shift a little bit. And can I ask the three panelists if they would come to and take their assigned seats? They will probably say which one is assigned. The one you sit in. That will be the assigned seat. We thought that, and we're trying to move this along because we know it's morning, you've got other things. We wanted to, as you know, we had a broad involvement from a lot of people and a lot of perspectives on this particular issue. And it was key to us to not only have the involvement from the administration, which we did, and we appreciate Secretary Preston offering that, but we also talked to family members. We've talked to people in the legislature, And of course, the provider community was also very much involved in the research that was done by the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. So we asked if we would have a panel who have folks who have read the report, if they would comment from their perspective on what they see as the things that seem to work well and at least match what they feel are some of the issues, challenges, and where they see the opportunities for us to improve the system. So up here to my immediate left is a member of the legislature, excuse me, Senator Susan Tucker. Senator Susan Tucker is in her third term in the Senate, representing the areas of Lawrence, Andover, Jacket, and Tewksbury. She lists as some of the things that she's done before is first, teacher. And I think that's important because she clearly has an understanding of what it means to services for kids and families from a very unique perspective. Senator Tucker has also served on the House of Representatives. She's been involved in the private sector on quality management, and I think that really helps fuel her desire to see a system and know that a system can be improved, and can be improved with not necessarily a lot of new money coming into it. So we're very pleased to have the chair of the Senate Committee on Human Services and Elderly Affairs, Senator Sue Tucker. Also with us is Donna Wells. Donna is the president of PAL. Before that, she's a mother of two sons, both who have mental health needs. She, after serving and raising those two children and having a very keen, unique perspective on a system that perhaps has not fulfilled promises, that pushed her in a direction of creating PAL, which she has done for 12 years. She started the affiliate in the Southeast. She now leads the statewide office, and she believes in collaboration, partnerships, and taking risks, all of which we think are going to be a part of the system today. I should also say that Donna returned to school to get her MSW after raising those young men, and we appreciate her help on this panel. And the third member of this group is a member who's been involved with us in helping to steer the report. We were looking for someone who's been around, and that's no pun on your age, Bill, but being around, not necessarily as a leader in the provider sector. Bill is the president of the KEY program, which is a large juvenile justice child welfare agency, not only in Massachusetts, but in a few other places. But Bill did his stint in state government, like many of us, and also brings that perspective to the table about opportunities and challenges that faced us. So I wanted to begin perhaps starting off with the question, and we can start with Bill, since we last, and we'll go back and let the ladies, and we start with Bill and ask the question about their impressions, what your impressions are of the report. What do you think are the challenges and opportunities for that? And I'll sit down and let you guys comment, and then after you finish, we can just go down the line. Thank you.
I don't know how to use this. I guess that gives you your answer. In terms of time, the only reason this study was done, the sole purpose, was to come up with a series of recommendations for improving the quality of services that both the state delivers and the provider community deliver to the families of the Commonwealth. The only reason for doing it. There was no other reason. And certainly the citizens of the Commonwealth care very, very deeply about the mentally ill, developmentally disabled, the abused and neglected, the youthful offenders, just to name a few. And certainly our Commonwealth, through their tax dollars, has directed their local, state, and federal officials, elected officials, to support a myriad of social programs. And our citizens want those in need to become healthy and certainly lead productive lives, and something obviously we all do. This report details a series of recommendations which, if followed, will help fulfill the commitment that the citizens of the Commonwealth, those of us in the room, have made to social programs. Certainly, for those of us who have been around for a while, none of these recommendations, if you read them, are novel or new. They've been made in some other reports previously, virtually all of them. I think what's unique about this report is the research that went into it, the broad-based methodology that was used, and certainly the fact that the report is being issued by the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, which is an independent group and nonpartisan group. I think that's what makes the report different. As a provider, if I had to say what I believe is the most challenging issue of these priorities, it's if you look over, or these recommendations rather, if you look at the set of priorities, it's setting the priorities with realistic expectations of what the Commonwealth can do with its money. I think the Secretary said it, and Mike Woodmer said it, of course not Mike Weeks, but they both said that we can't be everything to everyone here in the Commonwealth. And we need to take a hard look and do an assessment of what the needs of the citizens of the Commonwealth are, and then to set priorities, and everybody can't get everything they want, which is unfortunate. And the final comment that I'll make is that, as Mike Weeks and Mike Woodmer said, this report is not meant to cast blame on anybody. There are thousands of people working in the public sector, state employees, as well as in the provider community, who have dedicated their entire professional careers to helping others. They should be applauded for doing that. We don't need reform. The employees don't need reform. It's the system that needs reform. And with that, I'll close my comments. Thank you.
It's on now? Okay. I want to thank Michael for giving me this opportunity to come and bring the family perspective to this forum. And I guess most of you know about PAL. PAL is a state family organization of the Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health. And as such, our role is to advocate and support and provide education for families whose children and adolescents have mental health needs. And one of the goals at our statewide office is to bring the voice of all those families and all those youth to all of the treatment planning, the treatment program design, and the policy development that goes on in our state, because we feel that's the best way for programs to be responsive to the needs of families. We also want to thank our host, Boston Foundation, because with some support from them, we were able to really build an infrastructure in order to meet that goal. And we've come a long way with that over the past several years. And we have other pieces of support too, but Boston Foundation was the first to take a risk on us, so we really thank them for that. And I think the idea of risk is really important today because this room contains all kinds of risk takers. You're out in the field, you're running agencies, you're in state departments. And we're here because we know the human service system is in trouble, and we know we have to make some changes to it. And that's going to take a high level of risk, and we know that our decisions are going to make a huge impact on hundreds of thousands of people in our state, so it's a big job. And all of us here today are here because we are participating in this main tool for what I'm calling positive risk-taking, and that main tool is that we want to plan for the future by looking at the past, and that's what this report has done. And I'm always in awe when I come to places like this because I think of all the brain power in this one room, and I think we have to be able to fix this because there's so much, good brain power here, and everybody here is a good risk taker. Somehow, when I was thinking about what to say, I started thinking about, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could also learn from the future? And I have to digress a little bit. A friend of mine, Maureen, introduced me to this wonderful novel, and within this novel, the young heroine was able to actually go back in the past in order to make decisions that would impact her future and her past for her family and friends. And I thought, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to be able to do, to add to our study of what has also happened? And I really believe, and as a matter of fact, you probably think I've really lost it here, that we can. I think we have the ability to look at the future. And if we take a second to look at the future, we can find that our risk-taking is a lot easier and it's more effective. And I really believe that the opportunity to do this is to listen to the 600,000 people who we are giving services to throughout the Commonwealth. Things are happening right now because of the decisions already made that you as service providers know are happening, we as families know they're happening, we as advocates get calls every day that we know how these changes that have taken place already are impacting people in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We need to listen to them. That's the future. Or our alternative is to be here 5 years from now thinking this problem is huge, how are we going to solve this big mess? Because we see the indicators now of what those problems are going to be. We got to listen. PAL believes in partnerships, and we've developed partnerships with probably almost everybody in this room. It's really neat to see faces I don't get to see quite all the time. And I really like the partnership that came together for the study because I think it's a really strong way to bring the human service voice and community out to the community at large so that the rest of the taxpayers understand what this is all about. And I believe in most of the parts of the study, the findings, have some issues, but most of them are very, very mild. I really believe that we have to look at expertise. I think Ron said that. Keep expertise in when we're going to reorganize, when we're thinking about, for instance, centralized case management or bringing that all together, that we don't lose the expertise. My voice, of course, is around the mental health. I don't want to lose the mental health expertise that helps to serve these kids. And I'm sure each person that works with a particular population would feel the same. My response to us is to keep going. We've gotten a really good start. Everybody in the state working hard. I think we're very lucky because Secretary Preston is obviously a risk taker. And I remember he brought us together about the advocacy community about 6 months ago. And he said, we've got a real challenge in front of us. He gave us the grim talk. And he said that we probably hate him in about 3 months. I can't say I hate you. I really think that you have a big job in front of you, and I want you to help bring the family voice there so you'll make your job even more effective. So I'd say let's continue our partnerships and don't make decisions in isolation and learn from our future. Thanks.
My name is Sue Tucker, and just a little perspective on this report, which I think you'll find interesting, and a big thank you to the Boston Foundation that actually has saved the taxpayers over $100,000. 3 years ago, when I took the chairman of the Human Services Committee, I heard about all these problems in the purchase of service system. So I ran to Senate President Birmingham, and I said, I need $100,000 to study this problem. And so I got it. And we actually were in the process of putting bids out to study this problem. And then I started getting all the other reports that had come in on the same thing. And I started talking to the then administration. And you know what I did? I pulled that $100,000 and I gave it back because there was no structure at that point for the report to land. It was before the human service reform that we did this spring with a lot of cooperation. We didn't have Ron Preston there. We still had our agency silos, so I could spend $100,000 of taxpayers' money, and it had nowhere to go because there was no structure to accommodate it. So please let's celebrate success. I do look at this as kind of phase 2 of human service reform, driving it down to the communities, to the actual clients. Now, several years ago, I bought a pocketbook, and you probably remember this. You'd open almost everything you bought, and there'd be a little tag in there, inspected by number 219. And so I bought the pocketbook, I took out the tag, and the zipper broke. And I said, gee, I have to find inspector number 219 to complain about my pocketbook. Now, you don't find that much anymore because the private sector has learned that you can't inspect quality into a system. You can't inspect it in at the end of the line with number 219. You have to build quality in from the beginning. The private sector learned this years ago through whatever words you want to use, quality management, benchmarking, whatever. It's time for the public sector to catch up with the idea that you build quality in and stop trying to monitor it, license, regulate it, and inspect it at the end of the system, because it won't work. It's never worked for any kind of service or product. So I think this is a step in the whole idea of trying to build quality in. And just some advice, because at this point I must say it's unclear what the legislative role will be. I certainly stand ready to help. Most of this falls on the administration to implement. And I want to echo Donna's comment, input. Just because you've listened, listen again. And listen constantly to the customers and providers as you go through this. Share your strategies and your plans for implementing this. And if possible, draw a picture of the system and how you want it to work. Because I maintain that if you can't draw it, you can't implement it. You can talk about it, but if you do a flow chart, if you do a process chart, and I know there are people in this room like Mr. Morrissey who can do that really well. So I also like the idea that a standard should be that the government not collect a piece of data more than once. It is astounding what we put people through in terms of duplicative reports, asking the same questions from 10 different people, and inspections that go on to the point where I don't know how these groups even function. One human service provider told me it's 20 hours a week of staff time for an 8-bed residential facility just to fill out reports. Is that the best use of our resources? I don't think so. Also, I think just two last things, that we have to think very carefully about the measures, because what gets measured gets managed. And if you need an example of that, look no further than what MCAS has done for education reform. And whether you're a fan of MCAS or whether you're against MCAS, the fact that it has profoundly changed our schools. What gets measured gets managed. So if you go into a school and you look at what's getting managed, it's around how many kids are going to pass that test. And kids that sat in the back of the room with no attention for years and years suddenly become important because there's a measure, there's an outcome measure, a performance measure. So think carefully about these measures because they're going to drive a lot of this reform. I will close by adding a few comments to the Grim Reaper? Is that? No. to Secretary Preston's comments about money, because he's absolutely right. And if there's one other piece of advice, it's to tell the truth. And everyone in this room has told the truth, that this isn't a big way to save money and pump money into the system. But I will say that this fall and on through the spring, the American people are going to have a big debate about those billions of dollars and where they're spent. And I think there's a tipping point coming, and I think it's coming soon, where the American people are going to say, bring those dollars home and take care of our kids and take care of our elderly and take care of our human service system.
Thank you, all three of you. We have a time now for discussion from the audience, questions, comments, whatever. Yes. Hi.
Things that have happened in human services over the past 27 years, and what kinds of programs get been in the old point 4, point 5 placements in the educational system, but they weren't in there when they could do this. And then insurance companies stopped paying, so there was no income to pay the staff to do these kinds of things. So I love the report, the move towards it and all of that. The insurance industry interaction has me concerned. So I didn't know if anybody could respond to that or make a comment about it.
Would somebody like to or not?
I guess I can say from my perspective, it's not just the insurance industry. I think that there's no coordinated approach to looking at the overall needs of clients. So the health system doesn't necessarily talk to the education system. They don't necessarily talk to the human service system. I think the secretary, is in the reorganization or through the legislature that passed the reorganization is trying to move in that direction where there's more sharing of information, more coordination, more talking together. So although I don't do health-related services in my organization, principally, I think your comment is, broader than just the health area. So until there is some overall assessment of needs of the clients of the Commonwealth, and until all the parties are speaking together at the same table, the problem you describe, I think, is going to continue, not just in your area, but in all areas. We experience it all the time.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Susan Ayers from the Guyton Center in Cambridge, and I actually was struck by the headline in two different articles from the Boston Herald and Boston Globe. The Globe saying a higher standard is for care, and then the state is asked to set contractor rules. That sort of feels, as a provider, a little like, what have we been doing out there? And I think we've been doing a really amazing job of making the system work. The other state healthcare may stymie the services. I think that's more to the point. I guess my question is, how will you keep us informed so we can really be helpful? Because I think I actually am very excited about a lot of the concepts around the system redesign. And yet I know that we have to educate our legislators, all of our stakeholders. We have to bring people along. Are there ways in which you can help us know how to, keep us in the loop so we can be effective in that?
Well, I think the reality is that the Secretary Preston and his administration is clearly going to have to take the lead, and he said he's committed to doing that. And so I think that's clearly we will try to, at the foundation, obviously the providers work regularly, and we at the foundation will try to stay abreast of this issue and try to be helpful in that way. But I think we do have to look to the administration. Obviously, Sue, the legislature has a role to keep from the outside, if you will. Well, I mean, outside vis-a-vis the administration, but there's a funding issue. But then, and I think as this evolves, it'll be clear what the legislative role is. Yes, Donna, please.
I really believe, just as I believe families should be at the table, I think providers should be at the table. They have to implement whatever the decisions are, and they know more in the field what's going on and little things that you can't possibly see up in isolation. So I really believe that they should be at the table. I'd like to talk, too, about the insurance issue. I really believe that they have to be a partner, and we don't look at them like as another nail to hang all the fault on. They have to partner with these people, and we are all consumers in their budget. We need to really ask them to respond more to what we want as consumers, among many other things.
Oh, sorry. Yes,
I think, again, my hope is that participating in the process is the Taxpayers Foundation has made this one of their priorities. And as Mike Widmer said, that since it's one of their priorities, they're not going to walk away from it. A lot of reports have been written in the past, I think, have wound up on a shelf and been walked away from. I'm hopeful this won't be the case this time with the taxpayers' support. I would also say, as a provider, I don't think that we're actually held to performance standards very often. We report on how many groups we provide to clients, or how many clients receive independent living skills, or how many kids don't run away from programs. But we're not held to outcomes in terms of if we have inputs of client groups or independent living or run or behavior management, there's nobody saying, well, where does that lead? What's the ultimate outcome of that? Do you have healthier kids in your programs? Very, very seldom are we measured against that? We're measured always against the input, not the outcome, at least from my perspective.
Okay.
I'm Kate Kahn, state representative, and I've also served on the Human Services Committee for 9 years in the legislature. And I want to thank Mass taxpayers for making this a priority. And I also really like the fact that I see case management as one of the top priorities that we should be thinking about, and something that I've been advocating for. But my question is that there's an elephant in the room, and that is substance abuse and mental health issues. And I'm just wondering, in the report, I haven't read the report yet, but I'm just wondering if that was discussed or part of your focus.
Well, it's clearly part of what we're talking about. We didn't focus in particular on that issue, but it's really an example of what the kinds of multifaceted needs of clients and families that we're talking about throughout this, though we didn't focus. Yes. Yes.
I want to
Yes, Sue.
respond. And Representative Kahn and Representative Grant, I would have introduced. I didn't see you hiding back there. You've been such a champion of these issues. Just one example. Not in my district, near my district, there is a provider who is licensed and regulated by DMH, and he has JCO certification and Medicare, Medicaid, DMH. He has room and wants to open a substance abuse beds, which are just so terribly needed. But he can't because DPH can't get out there and do what DMH and JCO and everybody else has already done. I mean, it gets, this is an example of how crazy this is, that the need is there for these substance abuse beds. There are so many linkages with mental health, but then you got to have this little piece. I mean, there's not any thinking about people who need these services. And so I just thought I'd share that example of how crazy it is.
Yes, sir.
I'm Reverend Richard Richardson from Children's Services of Roxbury. I'm a member of the council. And I also sit on many of the boards of the small community-based organizations. United Home for Children was one of the founding organizations in Tewksbury that we started. And my concern and my question is, how does this whole reform? There's 1,100 providers sharing in this purchase of service, and many of them are small, community-based, minority organizations. How is this reform going to help strengthen those organizations to continue to provide a valuable service in the community? Because some of the feeling within the boards is that this type of reform may only make them disappear rather than help strengthen them. It might weaken them to the point where they can't compete. So is that part of the focus of this, is how to strengthen as many community-based organizations? If we're really talking about community-based services, how do we strengthen them to be able to deliver better services?
It's an important question. Certainly that's the spirit of this. Michael,
Yeah.
do you want to?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, thanks for the question, because
It's a good question.
we didn't really focus on smaller agencies, but it's clear to us that the problems that are going wrong in the system fall more heavily on the smaller agencies. Because you can imagine that $1 of service for them to have to deal with the necessary requirements and continued burdens that affect them means that's less of $1 that they can spread across. So their overhead costs are higher. So what happens when your overhead costs get higher? Well, then you get penalized. Well, you're not really running an efficient operation, because if you were like a large agency with a low overhead, you'd be running this light. So the question about incentives that was mentioned is clearly what we need to do. We need to put incentives in the system that allow small community-based organizations that are at the grassroots, that are working hard and doing the right work. We need to continue to allow them to grow and strengthen and build services rather than take away dollars that should be going to service and having them to pay for requirements, which really add no value to the quality of the service that people need. So clearly, if you look at this report, and I encourage everybody to read it, you would see that if there's going to be winners, I think everybody's going to be winners. I think we can now say what we did 30 years ago and say back to communities, okay, we're now going to allow you to use communities, have volunteers and citizens use those agencies as a way of bringing back services to folks. So I think it's a great question.
Let me just recognize my state rep, Ann Paulson.
Oh, Ann.
I appreciate the work that has been done here. I would just like to suggest that there be one more action item, if that's all right, rather than questions. And I noticed that the first one is to set priorities with realistic expectations of what the Commonwealth can do. But I think another action item should be to set priorities with the expectations of what the Commonwealth should be able to do. Because if we lose sight of what we should be able to do, after a while, we just drift back there. None of us think that we can do what we do. We don't think about we can do what we do in our homes. We don't think we can do what we do in the state level. So I appreciate organizing, making sure that all of the services are delivered efficiently and so forth. But I do not want to lose sight of what we should be able to do for our
Very important point. One comment.
Clearly, anything that delivers services in a better and more efficient way is good. I have two just very quick questions. On the use of lead agencies, I sort of want to echo the concern of minority or community-based organizations. Our experience sometimes with lead agencies contracting to other agencies is it's very difficult to monitor and to basically ensure accountability. We've had disputes sometimes with agencies where we try to get information on what's going on, and we find there's a lead agency, and we just can't figure out what's really going on. So I'm concerned about accountability on lead agencies and the right to information and public oversight. And then I think there's another stakeholder here that has been absent in the process, which is the voice of the workers. I know there's just, the problem about the salary reserve and the lack of money in terms of providing salaries for direct care workers is a real problem in terms of continuity of care. We know agencies where there's 50% turnover a year, and I don't think that's a good use of state dollars. I don't think that provides good services, and I certainly don't think that it provides long-term commitment to human services. And I think that as we look at reform, I think anything that looks at not having 5 agencies is really important, but I'm also concerned about how do we ultimately drive more money to the bottom, and I don't mean the bottom, but to the direct care worker
Sure.
who's delivering services, whether they're the social worker or the person in the
I just want to comment briefly on when I was talking about building quality in and using, again, the private sector learnings. It's all around that. It's around training. It's around incentives. It's around career paths, around keeping morale, and all the things that we're not doing right now. It's a disgrace the way our human service workers are paid.
Is there two more here, and Steve?
I'm Margaret Blood with Strategies for Children and the Early Education for All campaign. I applaud all of you for your leadership and really trying to propel this much-needed agenda forward. And I was happy to see needs assessment, and I'm old enough and have been an advocate for children long enough to remember the Office for Children, and part of its statutory mandate was to conduct needs assessments. And I run a nonprofit that's only privately funded. One of my funders, John Davis, the Davis Foundation, says in God we trust, all else we data. And I have learned working with the business community and the private philanthropic community how important that is. And I wonder, given the demographic shifts in our state in places like Boston, where we now know through the work of the Boston Foundation that most of our kids live in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan. We continued, I think, to fund the same agencies. And I'm wondering where needs assessment, where we really look, say, at children's mental health, where we know that there's certain propensity of children to be at risk for mental health and mental illness, where the overall needs assessment, looking at the overall population in the state, fits into doing this planning, beyond the needs assessment to identify gaps in services, but really understanding the overall demographic needs and changes, and how we think about contracted services in the context of the changes in the population here in the state.
Good question. Was that a... Bill, do you want to just say
I
one?
would say that the report doesn't go into that specific detail. What the report recommends that the state step back and do an overall needs assessment of the Commonwealth population that would take into consideration what you raised and what you raised as part of that process. My assumption is those will be issues that will be addressed as a needs assessment is done and then priorities are set. But again, the report itself is not, it wasn't geared towards individual client populations or services. It was geared towards the overall system.
But those are important questions.
Absolutely.
And the report is intended to drive this kind of focus, and so thank you for raising that. I guess last, I guess we're at the 9:30 time. Our panel's leaving. Let me thank you all for coming. The Boston Foundation, Secretary of Press, and the panelists, and the providers. Thank you. Thank you, Sue.